I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro, what clean label and natural really means for gums in pet food. Ask the Pet Food Pro connects experts with industry professionals and others and offers the opportunity to pose questions directly. Ask the Pet Food Pro is brought to you by Pet Food Forum and pet food industry's journalists and editors, drawing on our combined decades of experience covering the dog, cat, and other pet food markets. You can find our reporting and analysis at petfoodindustry.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our daily newsletter and monthly magazine. Today's discussion will focus on how the clean label trend is affecting gums in pet food. Associates Ingredients sponsors this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro, and our expert guest is Colin Hepburn, CTO for Macro Oceans. Welcome, Colin, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Tim. Let me just give a quick introduction to myself. Colin Hepburn, as you know, I'm the CTO of Macro Oceans based in California. We biorefine seaweed into different products, and we have a very close partnership with Associates Ingredients, who are launching, I think, a very exciting range of alginate-based formulations for wet and semi-moist pet foods. It's a bit of a comeback story, really, because alginates were traditionally used within wet pet food in the past, but I think they're making a comeback because they're seen more as being more sustainable and clean label in their nature. It's worth mentioning that we are planning to open a new alginate manufacturing factory in the US in the coming 2 years. What's important about that? Well, it'll be the return of manufacture to the US, so made in the USA once more again. And it'll be made, alginates will be made from sustainably sourced seaweeds, and including seaweeds that will be sourced from the United States and the pristine waters of Alaska. I've been in the hydrocolloids or gum industry, if you like, for 36 years. I've had a particular focus on food and pet food texture and stability. I would say my career's taken me all over the world, and in that time I've had a lot of experience in many of the gums and hydrocolloids that we're going to talk about today. So that includes alginates, carrageenan, agar, xanthan, gellan gum, locust bean gum, cassia gum, guar gum, and the list goes on, and how they're used as products, as functional ingredients within pet food.
Great. And we'll delve into each of those in turn as we go through. But first, before we do get started, I just have a few little announcements as always. Audience members, you have all been muted to ensure that everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. I've included many of the questions that you all sent in beforehand into our script, but if you have questions during the discussion, please submit those through the comments in the chat box. Please note that this chat is being recorded, and attendees will get access to the recording starting in about a week after taping. Okay, so let's take a broad view to begin with, and just considering trends over time, consumers have been increasingly focused and increasingly scrutinizing pet food and even their own human food labels, watching out for ingredients that seem synthetic or artificial. That's kind of what people have started calling the clean label movement, or have been calling for years. People are starting to avoid ingredients they can't pronounce, basically. So on that, how has consumer perception, particularly of what's on the ingredient deck, how has that become a larger factor in pet food formulation and ingredient selection decisions?
Well, it has become a huge factor. There's no question about that. I mean, everyone that's tuning into this today knows about the humanization of pets, or knows that pet owners are now known as pet parents. So we treat our pets like children, essentially. So things like health and nutrition, natural, clean label, preventative medicine, even longevity now. We're now looking at ingredients that can prolong the life of our pets. So for sure, it's a major thing. But I think also overlaid over the top of that is the theme of trust, and that consumers' perception is also influenced by what they trust. So they need to be able to trust the ingredients and what they can do and what they're used for in the pet food for their pets.
Gotcha. And that's even gotten kind of more widespread, that trust, as people have been looking more to social media and seeing how that is now shaping the conversation that consumers are having around ingredients. So how has that influenced gums and hydrocolloids specifically? And once people's kind of perceptions have become entrenched, how can that be reversed?
It's a really good question. Have perceptions become entrenched? Yeah, there's one good example of that, and that would be the view of Carrageenan and how that's been presented in social media. Can I say straight up, there is nothing wrong with Carrageenan. It's perfectly safe. It has a long history of approval within the FDA and also in Europe with EFSA. However, it doesn't matter. Social media has decided from the evidence that's being presented to it that it is a negative ingredient to be used within pet food. Now, not in all segments, but in most segments, it is now the case, and it's no longer. It may have once been thought to be demographically orientated, but that's no longer the case either. Across the board, social media does influence everybody in the choices of pet food that they're buying with the ingredients that are in there. As you mentioned earlier, it doesn't really help. We use terms like gums and hydrocolloids and names like xanthan or alginate or carrageenan or agar. A lot of these names are unknown to the consumers. It's different if we call them functional ingredients or they came from seaweed or they came from plants. I'm sure the perception would be totally different. Is it too late for carrageenan? It possibly is. To be honest, the industry's been trying to shake it probably for the last 15 years, and it's not one that's been shaken yet. In fact, as we see it, Socius at the moment, we see a lot of our prospective customers coming in wanting to use alginates as a clean label alternative to carrageenan.
So going a little bit deeper into that, as we're looking at some of those ingredients, like you're talking about carrageenan, sometimes people are looking beyond even just that ingredient itself, but they want to know where it came from. They want to know its supply chain and its history. So looking at that conversation about how people perceive these ingredients, how are concerns about sourcing, traceability, and transparency affecting consumers' trust in gums and hydrocolloids?
They're affecting it very significantly, I would say. First of all, the world we live in the last 20 years is different from it was before that. We are very sensitized now with media and what we hear and see to the environment, sustainability, traceability, where do things come from? Yeah, within the US, we also have some bad experiences. 15 years ago, melamine contaminated products from China causing ill health and death, in fact, in some animals. So, and in fact, even at Socius Ingredients, we've had requests for non-Chinese based alginates. So it's very clear that the transparency of that supply chain is very important to the manufacturers and their consumers, because it's the consumers who are pushing the manufacturers to be more transparent in where they are sourcing their ingredients from. And to be honest, we as ingredient producers and manufacturers of pet food who use our ingredients really have a mandatory duty now to be transparent and to show traceability and to show sustainability. I think that's where things are, and it's really part of the trust element that you were talking about.
Yeah, indeed, that's what trust and transparency kind of are all about. It's like as they're becoming bigger priorities for pet owners, that term clean label has become kind of synonymous for a lot of things within the industry, but it's kind of hard to really define. So within the context of gums and hydrocolloids, what does that clean label really mean today in terms of specific ingredients?
Well, it's a complex question, that one, and I think we'll come on to it in more depth as we go through our discussion today. But let's start with saying that some manufacturers, some consumers would like a label that has no gums or hydrocolloids on it whatsoever. But then that's a perceptive thing, really, isn't it? Because let's take one of the responses to cleaning up the label, tapioca starch. It's used extensively. Now, starch is a hydrocolloid. By definition, that's its classification. But it's not really viewed as that. So there's a perception issue there of what a hydrocolloid actually is. So tapioca is seen as clean, but yet something like guar gum or alginates or locust bean gum are not. And I could even argue that if you look at tapioca, it's a refined product. It comes from a cassava plant. They refine and extract the starch from the plant. Could you argue that things like locust bean gum that has no such thing, it's just a plant seed ground down into a powder, or a guar gum seed, is cleaner than starch? I would say in that definition, yes, it is. So we have a perceptive issue. As I say, I'll go into this a bit more later when we actually talk about individual gums. I think the other thing I would say is that, so, for example, there's things that don't even get considered now within ingredients. For example, is the ingredient or the hydrocolloid of the gum or starch, is it GMO free? Doesn't seem to feature these days. If you were in Europe, it would be a big deal. In the United States, it doesn't seem to be a big deal, but surely that's also part of a clean label. So it's a bit of a mishmash of what actually is clean label. But if you want my opinion, clean label means two basic things. It has to be safe beyond doubt. That's the first thing. And the second thing, it must be traceable and sustainable. I think they're probably the two most important things when we're looking at what is clean label.
Yeah. Before we get back to some of those specific examples that you were talking about, let's drill down a little bit more into what a brand can do to kind of communicate some of those stories. You mentioned a little bit of how consumers perceive carrageenan versus guar gum versus xanthan gum, and how that storytelling can play a part in it. How are brands nowadays expected to communicate transparently?
I think there's one of the things they've got to communicate straight away is it's safe. Okay, and that's the biggest thing about trust. The ingredient has to be safe. They have to be open about how the ingredient is made, and should be open about sustainability and its transparency. So there's different layers to what makes a consumer trust an ingredient. But number one, it needs to be safe beyond doubt, and I think that's the first thing. I mean, brands are beginning to use the term naturally derived. No nasties is one that's used. You see that one in Europe quite a lot, but you're seeing it appear within the United States as well. And that's almost an ambiguous term. What does no nasty actually mean? But it's meant to engender the fact that there's nothing in there that's going to be bad for your pet. And that's a different message from saying, this is an absolutely clean, 100% natural label. And it's actually very difficult to get a 100% natural label in anything. Just take the example of starches that I've mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, that is one of those things that, the communication of what pet owners want, what pet owners need is so important. But then there's a whole aspect of this that we also have to consider of what the pet food formulators themselves need. And so kind of shifting gears a little bit, let's try to understand why these ingredients are so important within pet food beyond even how consumers perceive of them. So first off, what are some of the most commonly used gums and hydrocolloids in canned and semi-moist pet foods? And what functions are they serving within those formulations?
Sure, I'm going to divide it into kind of 5 different areas. The first area I'm going to talk about is meat structure. And then within meat structure, we're either talking about creating loaf structures or meat chunks. And that can be meat or fish or whatever. Now, in the past, traditionally, alsnit, which is now making a comeback, was used within that. As was carrageenan, and combinations of carrageenan with cassia gum or locust bean gum, because they cross-link to give a stronger type of structure, or gel strength as it's known within the industry. Within the United States, a lot of alsnit guar combinations are used within loaf products. It's different from Europe in that respect, because loaves within the United States are more soft in texture, they're more mousse-like or pate-like, whereas meat structures within, or loaves within Europe are more meat structured, rougher texture, and look and feel very different. However, meat chunks are very much the same, whether that's in the United States or whether that's in Europe or the rest of the world. They do tend to use combinations of carrageenan, cassia gum, carrageenan, locust bean gum. But alginate is also now being used within that product. It was used traditionally in the past, but it's coming back, and it's a very easy one to use, particularly within retorted systems where heat stability is required. And very much we tend to combine hydrocolloids to make them retort stable. So carrageenan and locust bean gum cross-link, carrageenan cassia cross-link. Alginate is somewhat simpler than that because it is heat stable. The others aren't, so they need a bit of help within the formulation to stay heat stable. The next area is probably going on from meat structure, and we talk about chunks. We're talking about gravies. Now, we see a lot of starches being used within chunks and gravy applications at the moment. We also have guar carrageenan combinations. We often use carrageenan within the chunk, and we add guar, and we get into there's some residual carrageenan left after retorts. It combines with the guar and it gives a structure. Then we can also use xanthan guar, but a lot of these tend to be quite gloopy. Their cling isn't so good. One of the ones we're doing at Socially at the moment is an alginate with a little bit of xanthan. It gives a much better system. It gives a nice clear gravy, excellent cling, excellent finish on it, and an excellent texture, not gloopy. So there's different ways, but you could also combine alginate with starch. And likewise, we can combine other hydrocolloids with starch as well. And cost always does come into it as well, and particularly in the gravy side, but there's ways to combine the attributes of different hydrocolloids with things like starches to get different textures. Probably the third category is gels, which is probably like chunks and jelly is more prominent within Europe, I would say. But we do have things like shredded fish or shredded chicken in jelly as well, particularly in the cat sector, in which case we are looking again at alginates or carrageenan, or in fact agar has begun to creep back into that sector within the United States, primarily kicking out refined carrageenan. It's quite odd. It's one very expensive hydrocolloid replacing another very expensive hydrocolloid, but mainly within cat food, and particularly where the brand is sensitive to having carrageenan. So within gels, particularly premium gels within cat food, we're seeing carrageenan being a desire for carrageenan not to be used. Fourth category is extrusion structure and moisture. So we're looking at semi-moist treats here, and that's really alginate's domain. It transitions very nicely, very easily within extrusion conditions to create structure and to bind the water in and not to allow water activity to be prevalent and therefore to cause issues with stability or shelf life with the product. And last but not least is gums are also used as processing aids. And within any pet food manufacturing factory around the world, we have different packaging types. We've got cans and we've got trays and we've got pouches and different variations, and we all have to fill those. And whether we're filling the meat system or a gravy or whatever, we have the problem of splashback onto the sealing part of the can or the pouch, or where the tray might be sealed. And guar gum is very often used in that as a thickening agent, which is destroyed in retort conditions. So what happens is used as a thickener for filling, and then retort conditions then basically destroys the viscosity that guar gum gives you for that purpose. But that's kind of the five main areas in which gums are used.
Yeah, it's a wide range of ways that gums are playing a very significant role in formulation from, beginning to end. But consumers don't necessarily perceive that, and that might be kind of part of the problem is that there might still be some misunderstandings about these ingredients. You mentioned some, talked about carrageenan a little bit. What are some of the most common misconceptions that consumers have about those products in pet food? Never mind how obviously useful they are.
It kind of touches on some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, and you mentioned the word they can sound a bit synthetic at the beginning. And the truth is, yeah, they can sound a bit synthetic. For example, xanthan. Gum is a good example. Actually, a terrible name is a consumer-friendly ingredient.
Yeah. Sounds like a
Um,
bad guy from Star Trek or something.
well, I worked for the company that invented it, so I always look back at it, and it was invented by a company called Kelco. And I always look back at it and think, yeah, we scientists came up with that name. And the same with gel and gum. And most of the time, that's the case. We always seem to want to have gum as in the name of the ingredient, and it's not particularly consumer friendly, and it does create an idea of creation, created, chemically created, synthetic. And of course, in most cases, that couldn't be further from the truth. But that is a misunderstanding that we have about some ingredients. And as a result of that, there's an assumption with a lot of consumers that gums are not safe. And yet there's a lack of communication on where the history of many gums and hydrocolloids. I'll give you a couple of examples. Arsenates been around for 130 years. They've been, and before that, well, 130 years prior to commercialization, longer even before that. Um, and they've got a long history of being safe. Guar, again, hundreds of years. It was actually guar. The word guar comes from guar, the Hindu for cow, and guar for food, cow food. And it was a high protein source for feeding animals for many centuries. Locust bean gum from the carob tree in the Mediterranean. Again, a long history of hundreds of years of used for sweetening products, this carob syrup. And a lot of that history just isn't known, and they just put on labels as locust bean gum, guar gum, alginate. It's not always put there as gum, actually. It's just put there as alginate. Um, and even carrageenan has 60 years worth of of credit in the bank in terms of its history as well. And we could go even further back than that, but pre commercialization. So they are misrepresented, and there's a lot of misunderstandings of what they actually are. So they end up being pigeonholed. Um, and also, when we talk about how they're manufactured, if you start Googling it start Googling or asking AI, how is a gum manufactured? We start talking about acids and alkalis. But we use acids and alkalis commonly within human food for pickling, coloration, manufacture, preservation. So it's not unusual for us to talk about all these things. So there's a definite misunderstanding, misconception, which we have to be, we as ingredient producers and manufacturers of pet food have to communicate a lot better.
There's a difference between acid processing and making pickles,
Yep.
just in the consumer's mind, basically. But that actually, one of the things that you were telling some very interesting stories about some of these ingredients' histories, and we had to stop ourselves before the show from going off on tangents about anthropology and things like that. It's very interesting. I think a lot of people find it interesting too. And it ties into these factors of whether a gum can be viewed as natural or fit into that clean label. And that's something that what role can those kind of stories that you were just telling there play into kind of influencing the way people perceive these products? I mean, if it's something that's been used for thousands of years, how do you get people to understand that? It's just a kind of tangential question that came up.
Well, there's a couple of elements to it, and we really look at sourcing. Where does it come from? And
Hmm.
that affects our perception of it. It affects our perception of whether it's natural or has a clean feel or label to it. And also, how it's processing methods as well. Also, there's two impacts on how it can influence our perception, how we communicate that. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, we talked about xanthan gum. I mean, xanthan gum, probably one of the most synthetic sounding. How is it made? It's made from a bacterium source that came from a cabbage plant called Xanthomonas, which has been actually naturally genetically developed over many years. However, unfortunately, most of it is grown with not GMO-free ingredients, and it's precipitated in alcohol prior to the alcohol being removed, ground down. So it doesn't sound terribly friendly, but yet it is used extensively within human food, and it is used somewhat within pet food. But it's a difficult one. If you're really looking for clean label in pet food, it is a difficult one to kind of tell a good story about. But if you take something like alginates, which we do at Socius, I could show you, in 5 minutes, I could tell you how to do that in your kitchen now. I take some seaweed, some baking soda, a certain concentration, put it on a stove, and you can extract alginate. Simple as that. And all you're doing is extracting a naturally occurring compound that sits in the seaweed, seaweed fibrous network that exists. But then you've got others. Carrageenan takes a big hit, and at the moment, as you know, and the truth, and it again. If we're looking at the processing, it's the esterification of. It's actually an esterification process that allows the carrageenan, or the galactine within carrageenans bearing seaweeds, we call it sulfation, to be removed within a strong or hot alkali system. So is it terrible? No, but it doesn't sound terrific in terms of what goes within it. And actually it's part of its problem with its publicity as well, that esterification reaction. But I'll reiterate, I still think carrageenan is a safe product. Then you have some that are much even simpler, like guar and locust bean gum, touched on it earlier. All they are ground down plant seeds. That's it. They have a little bit of washing with water as part of the process, but essentially that's all they are. But that's about how they're made. Over and above that is also sourcing. How important is sourcing? And again, if you took something like carrageenan, and other types of hydrocolloids, particularly, for instance, guar gum, you have a lot of middlemen within those supply chains between the harvester, the farmer, or whether that be seaweed or guar plants in India, so therefore there is an exploitation level there. And I think we should be more discerning, consumers should be more discerning about that. Alginates is much easier. We at Socius and Macro-Oceans, but it's the same really for most alginate producers. We're directly integrated to our raw material seaweed sources. And in our case, most definitely, directly integrated right back to the harvesting areas. We work nothing but with harvesting partners to make our alginate products. So, but it's important, and in the image that creates to the consumer is also important. So, how do we sell the fact that it might go through quite a lot of chemical processing, but also what's really important is its natural origin, its raw materials. Is it lots of middlemen? Is it exploited? Is it nice and clean? Does it make us feel good about the hydrocolloid we're using? And it's quite complex, but some are better than others when it comes to that perception.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what we're kind of talking about here, is those expectations of transparency, and that consumers want to ask all those questions that you just mentioned right there. How was this made? Where did it come from? All of those things. And those are things that pet food manufacturers are now also having to ask. So as pet food manufacturers, what kind of questions are they asking now that they might not have been having, or they might not have been asking 10 years ago? What conversations are they having with suppliers that they didn't before?
And I mean, I've had some of those conversations with suppliers in the last, I would say, 7-8 years, where I've seen a big change. And in fact, I was managing director of a pet food texture ingredients company. We made formulations for pet food companies all around the world, and there's no question we had a step change about 7 or 8 years ago. And the biggest one was always, how do we replace carrageenan? And we just recently at the Pet Forum in Nuremberg, which is the European version of the Pet Forum show that was in Kansas City recently. And, there's no question that's one of the biggest things that's flown around. How do we replace carrageenan? and functionality and also on cost. And so there's definitely, I mean, it's the last 6, 7, 8 years, I mentioned the word no nasties, where, I dealt with a very large customer who put that on their label and wanted to be able to defend it. The only reason they couldn't say 100% natural or 100% natural origin was because most of the vitamins that we use today are synthetic. So often the label will say of natural origin or no nasties with added vitamins or something. Or no nasties can also cover the element of vitamins. So those conversations are definitely taking place. I've been part of them. But the other thing that's definitely come into being over that period is also, where is the product or ingredient made? Where does it come from? As I mentioned earlier, at Socius, we are now being asked, does your ingredients at all, any of your ingredients that you use in your formulations, come from China, for example? And that's become more prevalent. And even within the United States, and it's one of the reasons we're planning to build an Alston factory in the United States, is that made in USA, without doubt, is a very desirable aspect that pet food manufacturers are looking for today. So they're looking for trust and security within that supply chain.
Colin, that actually kind of ties in with the question that we have in our chat here, asking if you could comment on the labeling of these gums in pet food in the U.S. You had mentioned earlier about, with added vitamins, things like that. How are these gums and hydrocolloids being labeled in the U.S.?
They're labeled, well, first of all, US is very different from Europe. In Europe, you don't actually have to identify a specific gum unless it has a regulatory limit. So, for example, cassia gum would have to be stated in Europe. So within the US, it has to be stated by its full name. So if it was guar gum, it could be guar gum. Locust bean gum is usually called locust bean gum, can be known as carob flour, I think, is one of the distinctions that the FDA will allow. And I think AFCO allows it as well, but carrageenan has to be stated as carrageenan. In Europe, as I said, they don't have to be listed. They don't even need to have their E numbers on pet food, but they do have to have that in human food. But in the United States, it's very clear, and that's why you see very, very detailed, long ingredients lists, whether that's in pet food or human food within the United States. And the FDA demands that, every ingredient. And that includes any other type of salt or sugar or phosphate that you add to interact with the hydrocolloid that you're utilizing. So, for example, carrageenan will definitely be used with a potassium salt or some sort, and it has to be stated on the label. It's probably going to be used in many cases in conjunction with some phosphates, and they also have to be on the label. Alginate is a bit cleaner. It tends to be alginate plus a calcium source. It might be a calcium sulfate or something like that, but it may also have a phosphate as well. So every ingredient has to be stated. So it does make it quite messy within the United States. It also makes it a challenge to actually slim it down and to make there less ingredients on it to make it look a bit cleaner.
Gotcha. So talking about that and like slimming down some of these ingredient decks, and how are some of these consumer demands on formulation? How is that affecting the formulators themselves as they're trying to balance functionality, cost, consumer perceptions when they're selecting their gums for the recipes?
It's a good question because, first of all, just take a step back. You mentioned cost, and the truth of the matter is cost is a significant component of choice when choosing your formulation system for pet food. For sure, there's a growing sector for premiumization, got myself around that one, and of pet foods, and for sure that sector is growing. However, mainstream pet foods really still in two main categories: retorted canned dog food, which is definitely sold on cost, And then we've got canned cat food, and then we've got pouched cat food, and we've got premiumization within the cat food sector. Now, both sectors are very different. Cats and dogs, as everybody knows that's listening into that, are totally different. Cats are much more sensitive to texture and ingredients. Dogs generally will eat anything, with a few exceptions to that rule, but it's generally true. That's not to say consumers are not caring about what goes into that dog food, but they still want it at the same cost. So there's a big push-pull on manufacturers of pet food on way market trends are going, but also the need for a trusted label, less ingredients. And it's not one thing I learned in the recent Pet Food Forum conference is the demographics are not driving it. It is, we are in we're in digital commercialization, social media. We're in a different world now. People check more readily what they feed to their pet food. They check ingredients labels online before they even go and buy it. They will very often do that and then go out and buy the product from a store. So it's not necessarily they'll just buy it online. So in all of that, what can manufacturers do? And I think that leads on to the area of, well, how can a manufacturer of pet food actually change or clean a label without either changing the cost or costing a little bit more. First of all, what I should say is that hydrocolloids and gums in general, take guar out of the equation because it's a cheap product used for specific functions. But if we take things like carrageenan and alginate, which are making the comeback, and some of the other products, including xanthan and agar, the prices are beginning to converge. Some of the more expensive ones are becoming cheaper. The price differential is a lot less than it was in the past. But I think for pet food manufacturers, the thing they've got to be willing to do, I think, is, and also ingredient suppliers, because it's not just about the ingredient, it's about the formulation, is it's not just about the hydrocolloid and gum you use, it's also about the pet food product itself. And, what kind of meat system are we using? Cats will be different to dogs. So are we using, waste products from abattoirs and some of the cheaper products? Yes, we do. We know that. For cat food, do we use more choice parts of an animal? Yes, we do. And we know that. And they're processed, the processes are geared up for those meat mixes and choices. And so therefore, using different types of hydrocolloids or gums, we also have to consider what that process is. And that process may have to be adapted or changed also to enable a change. Because like taking alginates and carrageenan, they work in very different ways. Retort is what makes carrageenan work. But as I said earlier, it has to be protected to work within retort systems. But alginate does not, but it needs more care in how it is integrated with the meat to begin with, or the meat system to begin with, if we're forming a chunk or a loaf. So it needs a bit of work, but it's there. There's actually a lot of opportunities to clean up a label, but it does require not just here's a formulation, try it like for like. It needs a bit of dissection. Now, I've done this over the last 7-8 years. And once I got to know what the pet food manufacturer was trying to do, what equipment they were using, what meat systems they were using, what retort conditions they were using, all of those things, then it became easier then to suggest a label change. And was successful in doing that on several occasions. So it requires a partnership thing. It's one of the things that we do at Socius, to be honest, is that we are formulators. We make pet foods in the lab. That's what we do. We understand pet food at a micro scale. So it's really, so to make changes in your label, then you don't have to rip up the entire script, but there needs to be a common understanding. And very often the relationship is manufacturer of pet food just asks for, oh, we want something different. We want it to form a chunk. And this is, we currently use this. And they're very hesitant to give out information on the meat formulation of the processing conditions. Yet it's fairly fundamental if you want to make a change. So it's quite complicated, as you can you can see, but it's doable, and it's definitely doable to be able to make to clean up or simplify labels.
Yeah, yeah. Sounds like there's a lot of challenges, excuse me, challenges that you face when you're trying to meet some of these consumer trends to really, excuse me, still get the same processing characteristics. Sorry about that. Proving this is a live taping. So, so let's actually consider like another trend that's really influencing pet food right now, health and wellness. So
Mhm.
we're considering how do what does current science tell us about the digestibility? You mentioned palatability with cats and things like that before, and with some of the gut health impacts of some of these commonly used gums and hydrocolloids.
Um, hydrocolloids do overlap or gums overlap in several areas. And in fact, I've noticed, um, for example, I've noticed semi-moist treats coming out and on the shelves these days that have sodium or potassium ions. Actually, they use potassium ions to avoid having sodium on there. So the idea of having salt. Although I should mention that we use gums and hydrocolloids at such a low level, less than 1%, usually less than 0.5%, that the salt contribution is microscopic. However, it doesn't really matter. It's a perception of putting the word sodium on a label. So in the alginate industry, we're seeing potassium alginate being used. But nevertheless, what we're seeing within semi-moist treats is potassium alginate, and then we will see, aids digestion through prebiotic nature or effect, which actually is true. There is plenty of research, and I've been involved in some of it actually, albeit 20 years ago. Feels long now, but alginates at certain molecular weights are, prebiotic. They will stimulate bifidobacterium or lactobacillus within animal guts or even human guts, actually. But there are other types of gums out there that act in different ways with the digestive system of animals. First of all, just to make a distinction, starches are digestible, so they go through the digestible tract, they break down. Gums such as alginates, carrageenan, guar gum, locust bean gums, xanthan gum, they do not. They actually are classed as fibers, actually, and they do not digest as they go through the digestive tract. So therefore, they will interact with the microflora of the gut of an animal or of a human. So the products that are out there at the moment that, alginate is very distinctive within that realm, but also within the area of satiety. Guar gum is also used for satiety. It's actually used in human food as well within biscuits. But alginate as well there's a lot of published work on satiety as well. And you think, oh, do we want that for an animal? But remember what I said at the beginning. Actually, yes. The Pet Food Forum conference we were at again recently, there was a whole thing about how to regulate your pet's diets. How interesting we're becoming, and they're developing drugs at the moment on how to suppress the appetite of pets incredibly. So we're now the realm that we're going into. So there may be some other natural ways of doing that other than by drugs, and some of the non-digestive gums are good for that. Guar and alginate in particular. There's also now a version of soluble or hydrolyzed guar gum as well, and that's been in the human sector for a long time, and now and it's been proven to be prebiotic in nature again to stimulate healthy bacteria, reduction of oxidization within the animal, better regulation of stool health. Of course, for all pet owners, that's actually a big plus because I think if we've ever had pets, and we know that if pets eat the wrong thing, that very much can cause all sorts of horrible issues. So gut health is a prevalent issue. So there's a bunch of stuff there which offer up, alternatives to some of maybe the more synthetic compounds that are being developed at the moment as additives that go in to perhaps do the same thing.
Yeah, so we've been talking about some very broad trends or trends that kind of go across demographics, across groups. Gut health is certainly one of them because, as you said, everybody with a pet knows you want your pet to have good gut health. Otherwise, there's consequences. So,
Yeah.
what about some differences? Are there some meaningful differences, say, between dog and cat food consumers or even between global markets when we're looking at the clean label expectations?
I think I touched on it earlier, but I think we've seen a change on that. And back to what I said earlier, we're now seeing a premiumization, and premiumization takes many forms, and that includes active ingredients. It can be gut health, it can be nutrition, it can be clean label, it can be friendly label, it can be natural. There's a whole bunch of stuff, in there. But and if you'd asked me 10 years ago when I was involved in the pet food industry, when I really started to begin being involved very heavily within the pet food industry, I would have said less discerning. Dog food was dog food. Cats were more discerning. Owners choosing probably more on what the cat will eat and keep eating rather than rather than the cost. And it's always been the case that cat food per gram is much more expensive than dog food, just because cats have got a lot more taste and texture receptors within the mouth. Dogs don't. But truth is that's changing. Even routine, fairly standard canned dog food is changing, and we've seen a lot of labels changing the way they present their product, and they most definitely are trying to talk more about how nutritionally beneficial it is for the dog. Grain-free is used a lot. Anything that would indicate that it is more beneficial for the dog's health. We now talk about more more nutritional ingredients, added salmon oil, omega-3s. We even in routine pet food, canned pet foods for dogs, we have that. We're seeing more gourmet labels as well. So I would have once said dog and cat were very different, but actually they're converging all the time in terms of what owners want from a food. Now there are still some very basic value products that are available for sale, but I would say even those have some sort of beneficial statement on them, or claim on them that the product is beneficial for the pet in some way. But moist treats is really semi-moist treats, whether that's for cats, even kibble, to be honest, for cats and dogs. Again, that has become swung incredibly to the health benefit side, and even the texture of them as well. So that they don't want to be rock hard. And they want them to be softer, chewier. They want them to be good for dental care. They want them to be good for nutrition. They want to offer them gut health. So again, you've got this wide spectrum, and definitely in that sector, I don't see any difference between cats and dogs. Now, I think it's totally converged and very, very focused on what benefit that can be offered to the dog and the consumer, because it's the consumer that's making the choice on behalf of the cat or dog or any pet, to be honest.
Right. Trend convergence. So let me invite anybody in our audience out there. As we're coming up to the top of the hour, do please send in any questions you have. The chat window is open. So as we are coming up towards the end of the show, let's look at maybe the future, what the future might hold. As we're considering some of these ingredients that you've talked about, where do you see the industry heading next?
I think the industry is, well, where I see it moving next, I think the industry is going to push towards cleaner labels. I think the industry will push towards the perception of what clean label is. Doesn't do enough, by the way. No, and that includes us as ingredients manufacturers and also manufacturers. Now, in saying that, there are some, dog pet food brands, dog or cats out there have great sections on their websites on sustainability and traceability, and it's great to see. The only thing I would challenge them about is to what extent do you uh, to what extent do you take that back far enough? And I mean, to what extent are you happy that that's the case? And to what extent do you satisfy consumers' perception? I think Alsnet will, I think carrageenan will decrease. Every year I see the trend of wanting to replace it. So I see carrageenan diminishing. I don't see it disappearing, but I think it will diminish over time. I see things like Alsnets making a comeback, and I think they will do offer a cleaner label alternative. And I do see them becoming more prevalent as time goes on, as people then relearn how to use them and become more confident about them. They've got a cleaner story all the way down the line. There's no question of that. But a lot of other gums have as well. I talked about guar, locust bean gum. As very clean label products as well, but they need to work with other things, not just on their own. But I think the industry is going to get more. Well, the premiumization is going to continue in all the aspects of that. So it's going to push labels to change, that's for sure. But I think simplicity is also going to become a big thing. We're seeing that in the fresh pet movement as well, that simplicity is selling, and it's a very significant growth sector, which Alsnets is actually doing pretty well in at the moment as well. But simplicity is going to be a big thing. But retorted pet foods within cans or the packaging are here. They're not going to disappear. So therefore, to be within retorted systems, creativity is required. So I think we'll see simplicity and creativity as well. So it's going to require, and I do see it happening. I'm beginning to see it happen. Some of the conversations we had at the Pet, Interzoo in Nuremberg, and also the Pet Forum conferences, there's no doubt that people are much more interested now in talking about how we can simplify it, and taking the step of, well, also how do we be more creative with our actual pet foods formulation to basically assist in making the label simple in the first place. So so there's no question that I'm hearing that more now than 10 years ago. I wasn't hearing that. It was cost. Now it's different conversations.
Keep it simple, as I say.
Yeah.
So we do have a question from the audience. What can you say about the EFSA's reevaluation of the main hydrocolloids, and how will that affect manufacturers?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. EFSA, well, you would have known that within Europe, EFSA, if you turn the clock back about 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, semi-refined cassia gum was permitted with a regulatory limit. That changed probably about 5, 6 years ago, and it was no longer the case, and it had to be refined, which is an alcohol washed product, and that is used, but it still has a regulatory limit. I think other gums, certainly carrageenan is going to get a bit of scrutiny, I would have said, as will other gums. Do I think it's going to affect a lot of them in terms of, are there going to be any regulatory limits imposed? No, I don't. Other than cassia gum, there may be some more regulations on the residual matters, which may include pesticides, sterilizing agents, which has affected guar in Europe over the last 5 years. So Straight answer is I think it will have some effect, but I'm not expecting it to be major.
Gotcha. All right, we have time for probably one more question, if anybody has one. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and start wrapping it up. All right, I'm not seeing anything coming in, so I'll go ahead and start saying thanks again to Colin Hepburn, CTO for Macro Oceans. And I'd like to ask, do you have any final thoughts or anything like that you want to share?
I think my final thought is that, I'm going to use this final thought because I came from a world of initially of human texture. I've been in the industry of texture for 36 years. And pet food is complex, and in many ways is more complex than human food. But we've become very set in our ways and how we use gums and hydrocolloids within pet foods. We were very driven by cost, but I think there are now creative solutions. I've mentioned alginates, which we are promoting as one option, but there are other options in combination with alginates and other options on their own as well that work. So I would just say in closing that we don't need to have a major shift in our thinking. We just need to be a little bit more creative and think a bit more about what is actually clean label.
Gotcha. All right. So thanks again, Colin. Appreciate your time with us. And thank you to our audience out there. And please watch for more as the Pet Food Pro chats. And I'd also like to say thank you once again to Associates Ingredients for sponsoring this edition. Pet Food Pro Chats is brought to you by Pet Food Industry and Pet Food Forum. I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry. And I'd also like to give a great big thanks to the Watt Global Media staff who has helped to make this all possible. Thank you to our international audience for joining us. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day or evening, depending on which hemisphere is your home. Until next time on Ask the Pet Food Pro, goodbye.